Welcome to Make and Decorate, a podcast for makers who love to sew, quilt, and decorate. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Make and Decorate podcast with Stephanie. I'm Stephanie, and this is Season 4, Episode 74. So I have such an amazing show for you today that I am going to skip the normal chit-chat segment so that we can get right into my conversation with my guest, Jennifer Swope. And we are going to be talking about an exhibit of quilts starting on October 10th at the Fine Arts Museum, Boston. So if you live in or around the Boston area, this is a must-see exhibit. And even if you don't live in that area, you may want to take a trip out there before the exhibit ends in January. I think it's January 17th that it ends. This episode was recorded in August, and I couldn't wait until this episode was going to publish, and here we are. It is here, and I think that you are going to fully enjoy this. But first, a couple of reminders to rate and review the show. And I did get a new review last week. Thank you so much, Mary in New Mexico, for your review and for taking the time to do that. I really so appreciate it, and it does help the podcast. Also, don't forget to check out my Mighty Networks group, Make and Decorate Friends. It is completely free, and it is a private group that we can all chat. You can post photos of your projects, and it's not just quilting projects. It can be knitting, sewing clothing, bags. So come join us at Make and Decorate Friends on the Mighty Networks app or on your desktop. And of course, there's always Patreon, where you can get a bonus podcast episode every month. Many of my guests record bonus content with me that you will not want to miss. A lot of behind the scenes things and extra tips and resources for whatever we are chatting about on that episode. Download the Patreon app or go to the website, patreon.com/make and decorate. There's a publication book that accompanies this exhibit at the Fine Arts Museum, Boston, and I will put a link to the Amazon or online shop of the Fine Arts Museum, Boston. Jennifer and I reference to this book throughout the podcast, and it has beautiful photographs of the quilts and a few extra quilts that are not in the exhibition. I purchased the book and I absolutely love it. It is magnificent. So much great information, and the photography. So, that is what we talk about. And I just wanted to make sure that you know where you can find it. Also, I will put photographs of the quilts that we talk about in the podcast on my podcast page, blog page. All right. So here is my conversation with Jennifer Swope. My guest today is Jennifer Swope, a David and Roberta Logie Associate Curator in the Textile and Fashion Arts Department of the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. And Jennifer is here today to talk about an exhibit that starts on October 10th, 2021, called Fabric of a Nation, American Quilt Stories. So welcome, Jennifer. I'm so happy to have you on my show.
It's nice to be here today, Stephanie. Thank you so much.
Yeah, this is a really exciting exhibit, and I wish I lived closer to Boston to see it. But I'm very lucky that I get kind of like a little glimpse into it before it even starts. So this is very exciting. So, talk about being a curator with the Museum of Fine Arts.
Well, it's obviously an incredible privilege, Stephanie, to work with this amazing collection of over 300 American bed covers that span centuries. We always were having to redo the math on that, and we think, oh, it's actually over 300 years.
Wow.
that it covers. So it's amazing to think about how these treasures have come here, and really like our privilege and responsibility in sharing them with the public. And the exhibit is really an exciting opportunity to bring these out and show them to visitors. And I hope you can come at some point in the fall or the winter. Uh-huh. And the other side of it, of course, is that I get to work with incredible colleagues who have such deep knowledge in what they do, other curators who work across the museum. And as you'll see when you come and visit, we have a top-notch design department, and we have incredible interpretation professionals, programming professionals, and we really couldn't have done any of this without our textile conservation department and actually in other conservation departments. So it takes, we always say it takes a village. Many hands have lifted this project from the publication all the way through to the exhibition that we're looking forward to opening on October 10th.
Wow.
So those of you who can't come to the exhibition, we do have this great publication too. And we really want to share these treasures with people, and we want to hear what your stories are about quilts, and what stories these inspire for you and all the visitors who come.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. And I'll put a link to the book because I purchased the book, and it is just amazing. The artwork on the book cover. And I was just telling Jennifer earlier that, sometimes these coffee table museum type books are very beautiful and have gorgeous photos, but this one has both the photos and a wealth of content and history that I absolutely love. So yeah, it's a really good book.
Thank you, Stephanie. We worked with the co-authors, Pam Parmal and Lauren Whitley, and we worked for a long time. And we, again, just as I said, we have an incredible publications department. The MFA is really fortunate to produce not just beautiful, but really thought-provoking publications about its collection.
I agree. Yeah, definitely. So right before we get into this exhibit, I just wanted to find out, just you personally, if you have hobbies with textiles and art outside of your job, or is this kind of like your all-encompassing life?
Well, it is. Particularly leading up to an exhibition, it becomes all-encompassing. But I like to think I have other human dimensions. I love to knit. Although I think I'm working on a scarf for my mother for Christmas, but I think it's about a 2-year project. So maybe after the show opens, I'll finish that for her. But I've always enjoyed textiles, and I used to do a lot of batiking and tie dyeing and other resist techniques. Cool. And I always say that I am going to learn how to quilt when I retire or get a little closer to that. So I hope I can maybe learn from you and the other people I'm meting.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny because quilting is so much easier than you would think. Because I sewed clothing before I started quilting. And when we see these intricate designs and you're like, how could someone ever put this together? But then as you start learning, you're like, oh, I can do this.
I talked to someone who was a weaver, and her twin sister was a quilter. And what she said was that her twin sister who quilted would never want to weave, and she as a weaver would never want to quilt. And the other thing she said about her twin sister is that her sister liked to do cabinetry and cabinet making, which makes a lot of sense to me because the quilting, piecing is a lot like doing joinery, essentially. You're doing joinery with textiles. Right. So I think I would be really interested in that part of it, like the joining up the textiles with the grain of the textiles. It's like the grain of the wood, and then how the elements interact in that joint or the seam. Right. So I feel like I'm like, but there's always such a gap between thinking about doing something and actually doing something.
It's so true. Yeah. Because I just started knitting last year in the pandemic.
Yes.
And I must have, so I started with a dishcloth and I must have started that over maybe 20 times just to even get, and I thought at first, I'm like, how do people do this? I'm never going to learn this, but I was determined. So I just kept starting over. And then all of a sudden it's like, you get it. And I was so excited and I started making everybody dishcloths.
Okay, so I actually have a question for you about that, because I agree that the way to become a competent knitter is to just be willing to pull things out. Like it's actually like a lot of pulling out more than it is actually knitting the thing that you see as your finished product. Mm-hmm. So is that true with quilting? Like when you're learning to quilt, do you just throw things away or do you rip out seams? Like what's your eraser in quilting?
The seam ripper.
Oh, okay.
Anything can be unpicked, the seams. So, but beginning quilters are so nervous to make a mistake. And the more and more you quilt, the more you realize anything can be fixed. And nothing has to get thrown away. Unless it's cut the wrong size, but.
Yeah. That's true. But you can just make a smaller version of it.
Right. But that's why I love it. I'm like, anything can just be, it's just whatever you're willing to accept as, that's the other thing too, is like your level of willingness to accept error, mistakes, which makes it actually even more special because it's handmade. It's not a machine making perfect stitches. So quilters learn that level of, am I okay? Can I live with this? Then otherwise you're like, no, I'm going to take this out. So it's just kind of like that balance. And I even had a guest on my show a couple years ago and she had a dog, a lab or whatever, and she was quilting her quilt and he kept coming up and nudging her elbow. And then the stitch would go like this. And she said, I decided to leave it in because every time I look at that, I think of my dog.
Isn't that a great reminder?
Yeah. So it's fun. It can be really, really fun. So I think you'll enjoy it immensely. So something for you to look forward to.
Sounds good. Yes, I am looking forward to it.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, so Fabric of a Nation, American Quilt Stories. So go ahead and tell us all about this. And it starts October 10th and goes through January 17th at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston.
Yes, and the exhibition will include 50 examples of quilts, bed covers, and other works of art made from the beginning of the 17th century all the way to the contemporary period. We'll have the work of 15 living artists in the exhibition, which is very exciting. We're working on a terrific audio guide where we'll include some statements from the artists themselves speaking about their work. So we want to bring people into the works of art. The other thing we really want to do is upend people's expectations of a quilt show. We have some work by contemporary artists that actually aren't even made of textiles, but are inspired by quilt making. So we have Sabrina Gushfonder's piece called Camouflage. She uses 16mm film and actually makes like film quilts that she puts on a light box. So I know it's very exciting. But in it, she talks about it. The theme of her work is looking at women's work and children's labor over time and the price of, or the cost, the environmental cost and the human cost of making textiles. So we're getting into some deeper stories. One thing that the goal is to show, what is really American about quilts, even though we all know that quilts were made by humans all over the globe for thousands of years. It's not a unique American art form in any way, but what is special about American quilts and what can it tell us about our own country's history that maybe some tough stories that we haven't really talked about often, but what can quilts bring us into these conversations? So the 50 quilts and other works of art are arranged generally chronologically, like the book, but we break out of the chronology occasionally, just sort of look at the past. And one piece that we have is the Faith Ringgold Dream 2, King and the Sisterhood. And that is about her look at the civil rights movement, but also the women who contributed to the civil rights movement. And she did this piece in 1988 and included a transcript of her daughter Michelle Wallace's speech on this subject, which was very controversial at the time, and it seems so long ago, like in the late 80s. But when people were looking at the civil rights movement and reevaluating it, essentially, so we move through these series of 7 galleries, and in it we present. We start with the question of really who is America and what is America? Like what does this mean to be American? And how do quilts reflect that? And so that is like actually outside of the chronology in the sense that we want to open up that question. And in all honesty, of course, like no museum collection, no documentary collection, no one group of anything can really express all of American history. So we wouldn't presume to be able to do that, but we want to bring people into these stories that these quilts, either by looking at the objects themselves or looking at really examining what the artist wanted to say through quilts, can bring us into, and how that reflects on the larger history that we live with and the legacy that we live with today. And one of the things that's really changed as we've thought about this exhibit over the last year and a half with the pandemic is, is it our responsibility to bring something to the visitor that is relevant to their experience of the last year? I mean, I'm sure your audience, we spent a lot of time inside quilting and doing other things and making things for others and trying to understand what's happening together and overcome our sense of isolation. All of the divisiveness and this racial and class and social strife is it's been a lot. And I think that when people come and visit the exhibition, we're not shying away from those issues. In fact, we are bringing them out and showing quilts that relate to those issues. In the last section we have titled Making a Difference. We're showing some quilts, one by Sylvia Hernandez about gun violence, and another by Carla Hemlock, who is a Mohawk quilter, about the rights of indigenous people to their own sovereignty and their own culture, cultural expression, and so they're tough, but they're also beautiful works of art. And in coming together to experience that art, are we able to come together and have some of those conversations?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I was just thinking that this exhibit is coming out at such a good time to do everything that you have said, as to reflect back and see how, America through the past 200-300 years has progressed, and through quilts, through the story and art of quilts. And because they're so much more important, I think, to just even everyday lives of people throughout the centuries, that have really been sort of like dismissed as like women's work or crafts, or nothing really significant. But now I see a lot more acceptance and actually bringing light to these pieces of artwork and artists that are coming back to quilting. And I think it's wonderful, because these artists that maybe, like Bisa Butler, trained in painting, and then she turned her artwork into fabrics and into quilting, and her quilts look like paintings. And she says, like, sometimes in her Instagram posts, that there was no paint in this artwork. It's fabric. So I think it's so wonderful, and I'm really, really excited about these exhibits, because there's a Bisa Butler exhibit right now on at Art Museum, the Art Institute. So
yes, that's very special.
I have to get down there by the end of the month, because then it's over.
Yeah. Yes, it's a Bisa Butler's work is truly incredible. And it was absolutely we didn't blink an eye in choosing the signature object for both the cover of the publication and for the exhibition. The piece that we have in the MFA's collection is titled To God and Truth, and it is truly monumental. It shows the Morris Brown baseball team around 1899, and she based her work on a relatively small photograph in the National Archives, Library of Congress, and it's an incredible black and white photograph that W.E.B. Du Bois used in the Paris exhibition in 1900, it was one of 300 photographs that he chose to show African American progress after emancipation, and that they are these figures in repose is so important. I mean, that they are scholar athletes, and when she talks about this work and how she went into the photograph and tried in her quilt to reimagine and essentially like reanimate each figure and their relationship to each other. I mean, she creates essentially her own narrative within it, and then she makes them into literally as large as they were when they were living. Like she literally relives them. So do not miss the show at the Art Institute of Chicago.
Right. Yes.
Her work is really, really amazing, and to hear her speak about it. So we're going to have a video that features her and actually working on this piece that it's very special, and it shows her choosing her fabrics, and so we have a lot to offer visitors for the experience, the visitor experience when we have a lot to offer visitors when they're able to come to the exhibition.
That's really amazing, and quilters would absolutely love that video because we always love to see how other people pull their fabrics and how they think about design. And this is an artist. And I have just been, since I've heard about her, watching anything I can of her, like whatever, on PBS. I've seen her on an interview there and, some other places. And, she's just an amazing person. She has such a sort of just in my opinion, but like a quiet wisdom that's in her artworks just shouts it. You know what I mean? It's just, she's just really seems to be a great artist in person.
She is beautiful, incredible works of art that just stop you, in your tracks.
Yes.
And then to go on and listen to her approach, how she clearly, there are a lot of artists who they love the medium and that's what they want to talk about, or they like the concept and they want you to go right to the concept. And I find listening to her talk about works like To God and Truth, she just brings both together so beautifully. And I think that will be something that visitors who have any level of experience with quilts, whether it's making them or remembering relatives making them, or just remembering having a nice one on their bed, or some touching one, because it's a very tactile medium. That's another thing that we found, that in talking to people about the exhibition, usually there is some association with quilts or bed covers that is positive. And that puts people at ease to some degree. And so we're hoping that will sort of bring people into the work. But I have to tell you, of course, that because we're drawing from an art museum collection and we've acquired some work more recently, there's nothing typical about the quilts that we're going to show, because we could only show 50. And so the book, the publication, we were very fortunate that we could include 58. So it can be a little broader. And it's really hard when it's a wonderful problem to have, basically. We want to include everything, and we inevitably have to deal with the limitations of the square footage of a gallery space. So it's hard to often capture just how hard these decisions are when it comes down to do we get rid of the star quilt with this and with that? And a lot of those decisions about what to include and what to exclude are really based on the narrative of the show. Like, where are you trying to take people in the thread that you're trying to suggest? And so we're sort of starting with it in the title of the exhibition. The publication is, as you said, Fabric of a Nation, American Quilt Stories. So that title helps guide, every choice of object, every choice of word for a label, so we want to remember the fabric part, like what does the textile tell us, but then also what is important about that story, and how does that allow visitors to tap into the bigger story of America and how it's relevant to them, because we want to hear visitors' stories too. Like what stories do these elicit from and evoke for our own visitors?
Yeah, that's really good. I love that interaction that you're doing and not just exhibiting.
Yeah. It's not a march through then there were whole cloth quilts, and then there were pieced quilts, and there's nothing wrong with that, because it's a chronological, obviously it's like the time context, right? And wonderful shows have been done about that, and I love those shows too. But we want to make sure that we bring people into a space where their expectations are exceeded or upended, and but there will still be plenty there for people who love 19th century pieced quilts and beautiful examples of the artistry that goes into these. So there will truly be something for everyone.
Yeah, and I think another thing unique with quilts are that they do tell a story, and a lot of people who quilt love that part of it, because every quilt tells a story of some form, and that's just one of the most beautiful things that I think we cherish about being a quilter or an artist. And I think, like you said, anyone who has had contact with receiving a quilt, or family members making them, designing them, can experience this with your exhibit. And like you said too, these are the fabrics and textiles or whatever. This book, I keep referring back to, is so amazing with that, because you do that. One thing I was really astonished about is learning how way back, in medieval type times, where quilting was used to make armor for soldiers.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, it's a fairly simple, I should say this, it sounds arrogant, but it's a fairly simple technique, at least to explain and understand. So, the fabric sandwich has been with humans for a long time, right? Because what does it do? It provides insulation, and it gives the cloth all the more structural stability. And so it has lots of uses. And, if it was, if you could make a stone quilt, there'd be so many quilts, right? They'd all come forward in time, but they're made out of textiles, which don't survive.
Yes.
Same degree. So so it is, and it is interesting if you, when there were a lot of quilt shows that were starting in the 1970s and 80s and 90s during the sort of quilt making revival, which we feature in the exhibition in the last section called Making a Difference. There was a real need to talk about, to frame quilts as a sort of unique American decorative art, or a unique type of American art. And it's not surprising, given that Amish quilts were among the first to be celebrated as an American art form and worthy of the American canon. And it's just, you just have to go to Europe, to a European museum, and there are plenty of quilts in their textile collections. Right. And it's sort of, and we wanted to do that in the book, and we'll have a similar, we'll have a section in the exhibition called Unseen Hands, where we look at whole cloth quilts from the 17th and 18th century. And actually it's a great thing to think about as quilters today. So much of the artistry of quilt making in contemporary quilt making is, lots of different ways, obviously, but piecing is a big part of it, right? We talked about cutting up the fabric and making it all fit together. Right. But, of course, in the 18th century, in the 17th century, this fabric was incredibly valuable and expensive. It usually came from someplace else to the Americas. even if it was made here, it was made from very, very labor-intensive processes. So it was a high status object to have a full piece of cloth with like the selvages intact. So the last thing they were going to do is start cutting it up and making geometric patterns.
Right.
The artistry then is in the quality of that cloth, whether it's silk or wool or cotton, and then like the sculptural part of quilting, which is like, how do you quilt it? What is the quilting design? And so that's where I think our exhibit will really shine, because we have these beautiful examples of these 18th century quilts and 17th century quilts, and we're going to have them, being treated by the best textile conservators and hung and in with the greatest of care and lit in just right lighting in a gallery designed by our design department. So it will really be an opportunity to see these literally in their best light.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, absolutely. And those are all, before a sewing machine. So they're made by hand. Whole cloth quilts quilted by hand in these intricate designs that we can now zip up in like a big long arm quilting machine.
Yes, wouldn't that be interesting if you could actually program a long arm quilting machine to imitate a hand quilted stitch?
Yeah.
Like tension and like, because if you look at these stitches, they are crazy regular. Like in that time period, they were not trying to look handmade in the sense of what we think of as handmade. They were trying to be as absolutely accurate as possible, which if you think about the materials that they're using, this was like working in silver, or, this was it had very high value. So, and that actually is another point that we talked about too. It's like, how do you learn to quilt? Well, you don't start with your most, like if you were going to teach someone to quilt, right? You wouldn't bring out like your favorite fabric that you're saving for that special project that you're going to make, right?
Right. I wouldn't bring out my Liberty Tana lawn fabric.
But they might start in something that you have. Oh,
right.
This piece.
Yeah, absolutely.
So none of the works on you will be like anyone's first quilt.
Yeah, so true. So, well, I had a few that I really wanted to kind of touch on, if you don't mind. I want to start though with, because I'm in Chicago, so the Chicago Exposition quilt.
Oh, wonderful! My favorites. I love. Oh my
gosh, yes. I have the book about the Chicago Exhibition by Barbara Brickman, and it's amazing, like how Sears did this competition and everything. So, and I think that's what this quilt was made for. Correct?
Yes. So Barbara Brockman and Mary Kay Waldvogel are. Yes, Barbara Brockman and Mary Kay Waldvogel are two scholars who I have the greatest respect for. They have really unpacked this incredible story of the Sears Quilt Contest for the Chicago World's Fair in 1933, and the Century of Progress, and which is just an amazing title for a World's Fair during the Depression. And they have their books are terrific. They have great examples of all the ephemera and. When we think of the 1930s, or when I think of the 1930s, I think of like old movies and photographs and everything's black and white and it's the Depression and it's just like there's no color. But if you look at these quilts from the Sears Quilt Contest, we'll actually have two in the exhibition. We're borrowing the Spectrum quilt, which is also in Barbara Brockman's book. And then we have our own Richard Rowley quilt that he entered under his mother's name because according to his grandson, he didn't think it was manly to quilt.
Right.
But I think if you look at that quilt, which I hope people will
I'm
come
looking
and
at it right
see.
now.
Yeah, or get
go see it in person.
the photograph in the book is amazing.
It is.
There's a lot of detail in that. So just so people understand, he was a architectural draftsman, which is probably how he got those plans of the fairgrounds for the fair. And he used printed fabric to create to suggest the trees, the leaves on the trees, and the landscaping. And he used all of the incredible colors that I think it was Dennis Dusky who the colors were chosen for the opening very deliberately. So the colors of the actual buildings were meant to be very celebratory and essentially very optimistic. And I just love how the colors in the quilts correspond to these buildings that were sort of like, it's like a little play city almost. And then, that he used the embroidery to get all the details, just the way, if you've ever seen an architectural drawing, they'll do the same thing. They'll put in like the leaves are done in this sort of little sketchy way of drawing them. There's sort of these conventions of architectural drawings that then he translated into this quilt, which is it's just marvelous.
It is, because it's sort of like, you're looking down on it, but he almost did sort of like this axonometric, 3D sort of view of it too, where you see, at least two sides of everything.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it's very dimensional. So you're right. You can see his architectural, detailing.
And the way he did the waves of the water, so to suggest water.
Yeah.
And okay, so my question is, there are no other quilts that we know that he did. So when I saw that quilt, I thought, did his mother actually help him do this quilt? Because there's a lot of embroidery on that piece that gives it a lot of detail and dimension. The quilting stitches are quite even. So I think there is, and Mary Kay Waldvogel is the one who found this quilt and then uncovered the story of, because she had seen there were documentary photographs of it in black and white, and then it came up for auction. So she's the one who unpacked this whole story, which is an amazing story in and of itself. And so I love that piece. I just find there's endless things to look at in that piece.
You could just look at this for hours and hours, and I would venture to say that, yes, I would say that she did the actual quilting of it, because someone who just made one quilt would not get those, even of a spacing and stitches, like you said. And I think he really did like this layout and
maybe
the dimensional, like everything with the buildings and the trees.
I would think
I
think there's a collaborative. This seems collaborative to me to some degree, and we'll probably never know. But wouldn't that be fun to come together and just look at it and try to figure it out? And I think that's why it's so fun to think about having makers and artists come to this show and appreciate it from their point of view in that way, and how they see it through their eyes.
Yeah, and so is this part of your the Boston Fine Art Museum collection? Like
yes.
Oh
yes.
Wow.
Yes,
I know, because some of the quilts probably might be on loan from private.
Yes, well, that's Stephanie. That's a very good question. The exhibition of 50 works of art. There are 5 loans of the 50. So not very many for an exhibition. Mostly the collection draws from our collection, mostly the exhibition draws from our collection. We are borrowing a quilt made in the Poston internment camp of Japanese Americans. It was made in Masako Hirihata's 4th grade class, and she has since passed away. They were doing a unit on pioneerism, and we are borrowing it from the Japanese American Historical Society in San Francisco. They're very generously loaning it to us. And it has the names of the students cross-hatched into patches in between a lovely red and white print. And then we have a photograph of 3 children in the classroom, and it hung in the classroom, and 2 children working on it. So we wanted to borrow things like that we just didn't have in the collection, but we felt that we needed to make sure that part of American history was elucidated or illustrated by this quilt. But also the quilt itself is just what we were talking about. It's a very intimate object. It pulls you in with the names of the children, and it does make one think of what was it like to sit there and make this quilt in that situation of not being in the home in which you had been in not that long ago, in that period of disruption and pain. What was it like for those children to make that piece? And a lot of these quilts have been made in very difficult situations, either in communities that are under-resourced and in difficult times. For example, we have the Rachel Carey George quilt that was made in Gee's Bend in 1935, when in the middle of the Depression, which to me is one of the most incredible pieces that we have in our whole collection, because of she was able to combine these cornmeal sacking with half panels or partial blocks of log cabin made from what were probably old pieces of old clothing, and how she distributes this printed and solid and plaid cloth amongst what was essentially packaging. It's again hard for us to imagine that like most things came in cloth bags,
Right.
and that it's quite a statement of resilience and resourcefulness to use these old flowers, these old cornmeal sacks, and then she turns them into art. I mean, she just reuses that printed graphic with those solid colors in this beautiful way that we can't be there. She's since passed away. We can't ask her what it was like to make that quilt. She probably made a lot of quilts. They were used stacked up on beds. But in that moment of adversity and struggle, to make such a beautiful work of art is really inspiring.
Yeah, it really is. And we can get into the Gee's Bend because they're just so fabulous, and we're not really discovered until a lot of these women were really in their elderly age. And then they did this whole what do you call it? Like a traveling tour. Yes,
a traveling exhibition.
Yeah.
Yes, and so the MFA was one of the host venues for the Quilts of Gee's Bend, along with the Whitney Museum in New York and the Houston, started in Houston, and it was organized by the Tin Wood Alliance, and that it was a groundbreaking exhibition. And much like the quilt shows of the 1970s and 80s that featured Amish quilts and other quilts from basically the middle of the country in the Midwest in the 19th century, it was a new take on that. What was different is that the exhibition really featured the artists or the makers of Gee's Bend, the quilt makers of Gee's Bend, as individuals. So they were not taken out or separated from the work itself. And so many people, if you ask, like, well, are quilts art? If they're inclined to even think they would say yes, they will think of Gee's Bend quilts. And because they were, again, presented as art flat on walls, and their visual relationship to large scale abstract painting was part of the message. But then, was also part of what do we know about this community in which is called Boynton, Alabama, and what's the story of this really incredible community. And it's very moving. And again shows this intersection between quilts and the story of America, and it's not always an easy story, and we're very lucky to have such an early quilt by Rachel Carey George, and then we start with an Irene Williams vote quilt in the beginning section that was made in 1975. So that's a pretty big arc of time, and they're still making quilts in Gee's Bend, so don't worry, you can visit.
They're making them, and they even have an Etsy shop now. So I took a look at that. Yeah. And it's pretty amazing. I just recently saw this documentary from, like, I don't know, it was probably 20 years ago by, and I never knew about him. Arthur somebody, but he was from Georgia, and he was a writer, journalist, an art collector, and he was just obsessed with this Gee's Bend when he discovered them, and he, you know, told their story a lot, and he helped them, you know, like get well known, and he meant a lot to them. So he has since passed, like just a few years ago. But the story that he tells and what they tell, and it's just very endearing. And like you said, it has so many layers. And I mean, that story started back when that Gee's Bend or Boynton area was like populated and how they got there from North Carolina walking. So the history is so deep with that. It's just yes. Fascinating to me.
Yes. It is a rich story, and so many of these quilts that we're so fortunate to have in the MFA's collection and that are in other museum collections or treasured by families that remember where these quilts come from. You know, we tend to associate them with a sense of home and place. And, you know, when you start peeling back the stories, as you said, you know, you start to realize that there's a lot of, like the history of the country, there's in fact a lot of movement and migration. And it's not even one directional migration. It's often circling back and coming home. And these are often, you know, they're portable, beloved family objects too. So we might put them on the wall and look at them as art, but then it's something to think about of like, well, no, this was made by someone for a bed so that someone that they love would be able to be warm and comfortable underneath it, you know, right. from cradle to grave. And I think that's very resonant.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. So, okay. One more I wanted to kind of pull out is the Harriet Powers one.
Oh, yes.
And so this is part of your collection as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
The pictorial quilts. So, and this was back in, it says 1895 to 1898. So it's just, I mean, again, the artwork of this is so amazing, yet I think that it really wasn't intended to be art as it was made, you know?
Well, Harriet Powers is such a fascinating, she's a fascinating artist, and her biography is incredible. And we today know so much about her life. There's still many questions that we don't know the answers to, and there's a lot more work for scholars and historians and enthusiasts to do. We actually know a lot about her life because when the pictorial quilt that's in the MFA's collection and when the Bible quilt that's in the Smithsonian's collection were displayed, they were celebrated at their time. They weren't displayed in the art buildings of international fairs, but they were displayed in fairs and described in newspaper articles that were syndicated throughout the country. So, you know, we might, and it's also kind of to put ourselves into that time period, museums in America were very new. There weren't that many museums. So people went to see artwork, what we might call fine art, painting, sculpture. They often went to these international exhibitions, or they went to smaller exhibitions. And quilts were among many things shown at fairs and public displays. So if we think more broadly about sort of what was the visual culture of the late 19th century, quilts, while we might not call them fine art, or they weren't called fine art at the time, they were an important part of that. And they really came into their own in that period. And quilters like Harriet Powers, she made we can assume, I think fairly confidently, that she made a lot of utilitarian quilts. right? This pictorial quilt was not her first quilt. But she made the pictorial quilt and the Bible quilt most likely for display. Like she was very aware that she was making this not for a bed. And if you look at the way the pattern is organized, the way the blocks are, they're not in a bed orientation. They're not meant to like lie on a bed and have the edges fall off, right? It's a very different way. And each block is appliqued with either a biblical story or a story from oral history that talks about a strange supernatural phenomenon like the Leonid meteor shower in November 1833, which was before she was born. So that demonstrates that, what's part of the stories being told in her lifetime, which stories are important to her. And we're really excited because we're going to be able to borrow the Smithsonian's Bible quilt that was made by Harriet Powers.
Yes.
And they will be on display in the exhibition, Fabric of a Nation, American Quilt Stories, for the first time ever.
Wow.
They were never on display together in her lifetime.
Wow.
So this will be truly a historic moment. And I hope you can visit just to see that.
I hope so too. Yeah, it's just pretty amazing because I hadn't really known too much about her until I started reading this book. And I think it even said like she did some, I might be getting her confused with someone else though. Does she do commission quilts?
There are only 2 known quilts that survive that were made by her. We're not sure. There's not total clarity on how the pictorial quilt was made, if it was already made and then was a gift to a person who was on the board of the College of Atlanta, or if it was actually commissioned as a gift for him. And that's how that was part of its ownership, his history of ownership or provenance. And so there's more to learn about Harriet Powers, and maybe after this exhibition there'll be more work discovered by her. Certainly it would be quite something.
That would be exciting. Yeah. And
it still looks pretty exciting to have these both together though.
It is. It's historic right there.
Yeah.
Definitely. And then, quilts are still being discovered because, going back to that, Barbara Brackman book too, they searched out some people that some of these quilts were never known who made them, and they actually found some of the makers or families of the makers.
Yes. There's been a lot of work really started in the 70s of really they were state by state of quilt education, quilt documentation projects. And it was the first one was in Kentucky, and it was in response to, again, people coming to Kentucky and buying quilts and taking them out of the state. And so people in Kentucky said, hey, like this is part of our cultural heritage. We need to document this. And so Kentucky had the first quilt documentation project. And I'm told I've only read about it. And it set a course for other states doing their own quilt documentation projects, and they're just amazing. I've never actually been to one. A former colleague and friend was involved in the Rhode Island quilt documentation project, and I wish I could have gone to one because people love talking about their quilts, and they'd bring them together to one place, and they documented all the quilts that people brought, and they created a real record of quilts by place. And again, they're just endlessly fascinating. It's an endlessly fascinating art form, and I hope that you can come and see all of these different
I do too,
different
definitely.
Examples on view from our collection.
Yeah. And then just one more thing about the documenting, that's something that right now is heavily stressed with people who quilt, is to label their quilts. Label them with the maker, the date, where it was made, and who quilted it. So those are the 4 main components of like labeling your quilt. And so that I think it's so important to do because of, seeing these quilts throughout the centuries. And, do some of them, are they signed by or somehow labeled by the maker, or did that not really start until maybe the 70s?
You would be surprised. Some quilts come down with tiny little labels pinned to them with handwritten labels. Some quilts actually have dates or initials actually quilted in with quilting stitches. Some of our most important quilts, like the beautiful double wedding ring that is from Missouri. It was just found in an estate sale, and we don't know, we're not able to reconstruct anything about it. And I think it's one of the most beautiful quilts in the collection. And really and that wasn't really made all that long ago. So it's interesting that your question is really interesting because it gets at, just because something is old and more time has passed doesn't mean that we are less likely to know something about it. In fact, sometimes we are more likely to know something about it because it's been special and recognized as something special for so long. So it just varies. And that's kind of the fun part of my job is pulling together all these different disparate and distinct threads and trying to come up with something like, why is this important? But I celebrate all quilters today who are diligently filling out their cloth labels and attaching them to the back, because it is amazing how quickly that is lost. You're basically one generation away from forgetting who exactly made this and for what occasion and when. It seems so, I could see if I made something, I'm like, of course I made that. I can tell you exactly when I made that. But I bet if you went back and looked at your quilts that you've made and you tried to figure out, like, did I make that 5 years ago or 4 years ago or 3 years ago? You might make mistakes yourself, right? Like you'd be slightly off, right?
Slightly off, right. Absolutely.
So it's like once you're done with it, you think like if you're the maker and you're done with it, and you can't remember, like who's going to remember?
That's so true. So true. Yes. Although now we have these quilt fabric designers. So some of the real popular ones, like Tula Pink, we could probably tell the age of that quilt based on when her certain collection was out, because quilt fabrics, they introduce collections, and once it's gone, it's gone. So it's not like it stays over time. So
it's like a tag. You can date it by the fabric. And we actually do that too. So we'll look at something. It's often it can't be any earlier than X, right? It's like, it has this fabric. We know that they didn't really do this kind of roller printed cotton print until this period of time. But it's very it's not a tight diagnosis. Right. It's very,
so
very
true. Well, that's true, because you can't really go by that, because some people buy these fabrics and then they put them in their stash, and then they may not use them for like 5 years later or 10 years later. So you're right. Yeah.
Sure. We have a beautiful quilt by Florence Pito, who did just that. She collected quilts, she sold quilts, she gave lectures on quilts, and then she also collected old textiles. So old, like hand spun linen and printed cloth from the 18th and 19th century. That was British, and then she used those to make new quilts in the 1950s.
Wow!
And she would use to teach people about quilting. And so we have the flower pot quilt that she made around 1952 in the exhibition, and that is exactly it. It's like going back into your stash and pulling out something that is very special from long ago,
right?
Because this is like just the quilt that she wanted to make.
Yes.
So come and see that one too, Stephanie.
Yes. Oh my gosh, I have to try. Modern art quilters, how do they get their work in museum galleries today?
That is a very big question. And I think that, I think SAQA does a great job of having traveling exhibitions that bring people to it. The Women of Color Quilters Network, that was founded in 1985 by Dr. Carolyn Metz-Lumi, helps. And Dr. Carolyn Metz-Lumi also organizes a lot of exhibitions. So she was the founder of the Women of Color Quilters Network, and also pulls from that group and that network to put together really interesting exhibitions of contemporary work. They're very story laden quilts.
Yeah, her work is really beautiful because she always includes a traditional patchwork in her border around her art quilt. It's so cool. I just saw a documentary with her and Bisa Butler together, so I was fascinated. That's really cool. Yeah, you know what? You're right. These kind of groups are probably the ways to start if you want to be an art quilter. And to get your work noticed. In addition to, like, I know there's, annual quilt shows that have juried quilts and stuff like that. So I think that's probably another way. But I was always curious about how do museums really, pull these modern quilts into their, it's easy to understand how you'd pull in antiquities and stuff like that. But like, modern people like working today with their art.
It's very challenging, and we did acquire a number of contemporary pieces for this exhibition that, again, their work fit into the story that we were trying to suggest and explore. It is very difficult to think about contemporary work and what's going to be important in 10, 15, 50, 100, 200 years. And so there's no single answer
I
to
guess
that.
it's the same across the board of art, period. Sculptural, painting, and like there's that
photography. Think how many photographers there are.
Yeah.
Like, how does one decide
so true. Yeah.
that this is the next, this is the next.
Ansel Adams.
Yes, I was going to say, I was trying to think of a woman photographer. This is terrible. I should think of a woman photographer. Doris Ullman. Who's the next Doris Ullman? Like, who's the next Dorothea Lange? Like, where are you going to find that person? Right. And how does one do that? And I think, there's no simple answer to that. And except I do believe that really art, it's not only art is everywhere. Art is being made right now as we're speaking. It's part of the human condition, and it's so I think that it's I think like all people working in the broader cultural fields, whether we're makers or curators or conservators or enthusiasts or collectors, I think we're all trying to keep our eyes open to new things and to connecting people with each other through art.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, and one last really quick thing, sorry.
No
On
problem.
conservation, I know that you have like an amazing conservation lab. Just any tips on conserving quilts for quilt collectors, maybe? Just something quick. Like wear white gloves when you handle it, or I know keep it out of the sun. I know that's one of the things.
Yeah, so that's actually, it's great that you say that, Stephanie. Obviously, once the textile, this is very, I am not a textile conservator. People go study this.
I'm sure.
This is a field of great expertise, and I have incredible respect for the expertise of my colleagues in both textile conservation and olive conservation. But I can say, as a non-conservator, that once the textile fades, you can't go back. You cannot turn back the clock to put color back.
There's no restoration of the color.
Okay. No restoration of the color. So light is really the enemy. And beyond that, you just want to keep things in a relatively stable environment. So actually, I don't know, the quilt collector Gerald Roy of Pilgrim Roy, he always points out that quilts are sort of like human beings. They don't like it to be too humid. They don't like it to be too dry. They don't like it to be too hot, too cold, and avoid fluctuations. Do you want to live in your attic or basement? Probably not.
Right. Temperature controlled. Right. And out of the sun. Yeah, we don't want to be in the sun for too long.
We don't want to get fried. Yeah. We don't be underwater.
That's pretty common sense right there. So very good. Very, very good. Well, thank you so much for coming on to my show. This is just a complete honor for me. So I appreciated that Amelia contacted me about this exhibit. And it was such a pleasure talking with you and learning all about the exhibit and these quilts, these wonderful quilts.
Well, thank you, Stephanie. I really enjoyed the conversation as well, and I hope that we'll have a chance to meet in person while the show's up or any time that you come to Boston.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much. And I will include all of the information of the exhibition on the show notes and my podcast blog page.
Great,
Okay.
great. And the publication, too, if people want to get the publication.
The publication is amazing, so I'll put that
a good
on there
gift
too.
For Christmas, right?
Yes.
A good gift for the holidays.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. All right. Thank you.
All right. Have a great afternoon. Bye, Stephanie.
Bye. If you would like a bonus episode every month, become a patron and support the Make and Decorate podcast show at my Patreon page, Make and Decorate. For extended show notes with links and photos to what we've talked about, visit my podcast blog at makeanddecorate.com. And remember to take some time for yourself to be creative. Bye-bye.